In 1965, one of the richest countries in the world today was kicked out of its own union. Not accepted, not welcomed, kicked out. No oil, no gold, no natural resources of any kind. A tiny island, smaller than New York City, with almost 2 million people crammed onto it, and no fresh water of its own. They had to import their own drinking water just to survive. Most economists at the time gave this country almost no chance of making it on its own. But 60 years later, that same island has one of the highest GDP per capita numbers on the entire planet. Richer per person than the United States, richer than the United Kingdom, richer than almost every country you can name. This is the story of Singapore, how a poor, resourceless island, with almost no chance of survival, quietly became one of the wealthiest places on Earth. And it all started with a man who many people had already written off. His name was Kuan. In August 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, following political and racial tensions that made the union impossible to hold together. Lee had fought hard for Singapore to remain part of Malaysia. When it was forced out instead, he stood in front of television cameras and cried. That moment tells you everything about how uncertain Singapore's future actually looked. Site index equals 11-1 at that moment. Singapore's GDP per capita was around $400 a year/site, similar to some of the poorest nations in Africa at the time. No natural resources to sell, no large domestic market to rely on, no powerful military to protect its interests, just a small island surrounded by much larger neighbors, suddenly forced to survive completely on its own. Most newly independent nations in that era tried the same strategy: protect local industries, keep foreign companies out, build self-sufficiency slowly, behind closed borders. Kuan did the exact opposite. And that single decision, going against almost everyone else in the world at the time, is where Singapore's transformation actually begins. But it wasn't going to be easy. And what Lee was about to do would require him to make some deeply controversial choices. Choices that still spark debate about Singapore's success to this very day. Here's the strategy nobody else was trying. Instead of protecting Singapore's economy from the outside world, Kuan threw the doors wide open. Site index equals 13-1. While other newly independent nations raised tariffs to protect their local industries, Singapore went all in on free trade, removing barriers instead of building them. /site. The idea was simple, even if it was risky. If Singapore had no natural resources of its own, it needed to become useful to everyone else instead. A place where global companies wanted to set up shop, a place where money, goods, and people could move freely, with almost none of the red tape found elsewhere in the region. Singapore leaned into something it already had: its location, sitting directly along one of the busiest shipping routes on Earth, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Singapore had been a major trading port for over a century, dating back to its days as a British colonial outpost. Kuan didn't invent that advantage, but he built an entire nation on top of it. The government invested heavily in the port, in infrastructure, and in making Singapore one of the easiest, most reliable places on Earth to do business. Foreign companies were welcome, not restricted. Corruption, which crippled economic growth across much of the region, was attacked aggressively through strict laws and real consequences for officials who broke them. Site index equals 16-1. From 1965 to 1973 alone, Singapore's economy grew at an average of nearly 13% a year/site, one of the fastest sustained growth rates any country has ever recorded. But there was a cost to all of this, and it's the part of Singapore's story that most success narratives conveniently leave out. Kuan Yew's Singapore was not a liberal democracy in the way most Western countries understand the term. Political opposition was tightly restricted. The press operated under heavy government influence. Certain civil liberties that citizens in other wealthy nations take for granted were, and in some ways still are, limited in Singapore. Lee openly believed that strong, centralized leadership, even at the cost of some personal freedoms, was necessary to hold together a small, ethnically diverse nation with almost no natural advantages. Critics called it authoritarian. Supporters called it the only realistic path a country this vulnerable could have taken. Both sides of that argument are still being debated by historians and economists today. But whatever you think of the methods, the results were becoming impossible to ignore. New factories opened, unemployment, once a massive crisis, began falling sharply, and the government started one of its most ambitious projects yet. One that would completely transform daily life for nearly every person living on the island. Because economic growth alone wasn't the full plan. Kuan was about to do something with the money coming in that very few governments in history have managed to pull off successfully. And that decision is where Singapore's story takes its most surprising turn yet. Most countries that experience rapid economic growth eventually run into the same problem. The money flows to a small group at the top, while everyone else gets left behind. Singapore took a different approach. As money poured into the country, the government used it to build one of the most ambitious public housing programs the world had ever seen. Massive apartment blocks went up across the island, built and heavily subsidized by the state, giving ordinary citizens access to homeownership at a scale almost no other country has matched. Today, Site Index equals 16-1. The vast majority of Singaporeans live in government-built housing that they actually own/site, a strategy that gave nearly everyone on the island a direct financial stake in the country's continued success. At the same time, the government poured resources into education, turning a population with limited schooling into one of the most highly educated workforces in the world within a single generation. Singapore didn't just want factories. It wanted the kind of skilled workers that could eventually attract higher-paying industries, finance, technology, biomedical research, the kind of jobs that transform not just an economy, but an entire society's standard of living. That strategy worked better than almost anyone could have predicted. By 2026, Singapore's GDP per capita reached approximately $107, $758/site, placing it among the wealthiest nations on Earth on a per-person basis, ahead of the United States, ahead of almost every country in Europe. Think about that for a moment. A country with no oil, no natural resources, no large domestic market. A country that had to import its own drinking water at independence. And yet, 60 years later, the average person living there is, on paper, wealthier than the average American. Singapore did it by making a series of decisions almost no other country was willing to make at the time. Opening its economy when others were closing theirs. Attacking corruption aggressively when it was tolerated almost everywhere else in the region. Investing enormous amount of government money directly into housing and education, rather than letting growth benefit only a wealthy few. It came with real trade-offs. Political freedoms that citizens in other wealthy democracies take for granted remain more limited in Singapore. Even today, that tension between economic success and political control is still debated inside Singapore and around the world to this day. But the core lesson of Singapore's rise is hard to argue with. A country doesn't need natural resources to become wealthy. It doesn't need a massive population or a powerful military. Sometimes, all it needs is a clear strategy, ruthless execution, and the willingness to make decisions that almost nobody else believed would work. In 1965, the world watched a tiny, resourceless island get expelled from its own union, with almost no chance of survival. 60 years later, that same island became proof that where you start has very little to do with where you can end up.